bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey everybody, welcome to Society and the State. Connor here, flying solo for this episode. Brian is traveling, so we'll excuse him today. This is episode number 82. We're going to have some fun links on the show notes page because we are talking today with the man behind the movement of the 10th Amendment. We're going to talk all about it and his organization, the 10th Amendment Center. We're talking today, of course, with Michael Boldin. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Awesome to be here. Thanks, Connor.
So I want to start maybe at the beginning. Why did you start the 10th Amendment Center? When did you start it? What was the motivation? And then we're going to get into some of the outgrowth of what you've actually been doing.
Oh, man, we can go the short version or the juicy details, but I started back in 2006, and unlike many people who are in this kind of broader liberty movement or more narrowly this 10th Amendment and what we work on, nullification movement, a lot of people tell me, oh, I came from the right. I'm a former neocon, former George Bush supporter. I'm a former hard leftist, and I spent some time, a few years, doing some activism in the anti-war movement, which I'm very philosophically I'm in favor of still. But I started noticing over the years that I was there that it wasn't really an anti-war movement, which would have been great if it was just anti-war. Instead, it was a let's substitute these spending programs domestically for the foreign policy that we disagree with. And that I was very disheartened with that. And at some point, it's just growth. And I'm still going through growth as I get older and older here. But I learned that, whatever the government promises to do was always a failure, or it cost way more than what they promised, or it just never came true.
For sure.
And so my line in the sand really was the 10th Amendment. I thought back in 2006, okay, you know what? I'm just going to start blogging and talking to people and explaining how, it's not just the Patriot Act or the Real ID Act, but basically everything that Washington, D.C. does is either not authorized by the rules given to them in the Constitution, or it just never pans out how they tell us. And that's where we can go on from there.
Well, and so you formed this organization at probably exactly the right time, because it was shortly after that that we had the rise of the Tea Party and a lot of this focused attention on congressional power and the 10th Amendment. Of course, Tom Wood's book then came out where he talks all about nullification. And so you guys were kind of primed and ready to go. Give me your kind of snapshot. Looking back, a decade plus, what are some of the things that the 10th Amendment Center has had its hands in? What are some of the accomplishments that you can point back to and say, because we exist, here's what we were able to do?
I have to learn how to toot my own horn because I'm always going to understate this. But what people tell me is, well, you guys built the nullification movement. I know for a fact when Tom was working on that book, he reached out to – this is where Tom and I developed a friendship as well. He said he was working on a different book at the time, but he saw this movement picking up and people talking all over the internet about nullification and asking him about it. And he's like, oh, man, I'm going to switch gears and knock this book out because it's picking up steam. This is something – and in his earlier speeches on this, he would talk about how, I never expected to actually be talking to activist groups about nullification. I just didn't think it was going to happen. It was lost in the rabbit hole. So we certainly put that out into the public kind of consciousness. And now we also see kind of a more narrow version of that in the legal world called anti-commandeering, which is the Supreme Court precedent based on James Madison's advice in Federalist 46 that states, localities don't have to use resources or personnel to help enforce or effectuate federal acts or regulatory programs. And this has now become kind of a mainstream thing on the left and right. People generally just understand this is the case. And as Madison taught us, this is a very effective way of undermining and bringing federal programs to an end. So this is – I don't think it's really in much dispute that that's actually the case now. And we kind of took this arcane legal principle and put it into the mainstream.
So I'm going to share a little story briefly before I set up the next question for you. Most of our listeners probably don't know that before I started Libertas Institute, I ran one of your state chapters here in Utah. You guys don't really have the state chapter model anymore, right? Haven't you pivoted away from that? So at the time, though, you did, and I ran the Utah chapter, and we worked alongside one another to try and incorporate these ideas and increase the understanding of the importance of the 10th Amendment and state sovereignty. To that end, we purchased a copy of Tom Wood's book after it came out. We sent it to every legislator. We sent it to the governor and the attorney general, so on and so forth. And so what you find, though, is that you have many people who are familiar with these ideas. And so here's the question, right? When I was engaged directly with the 10th Amendment Center, it was very much preaching the doctrine of nullification and talking about the 10th Amendment in very explicit terms. My question for you is that the most effective way, or do we use other issues as kind of the vehicle through which we bring up the principle? Specifically, I'm thinking of an example like, say, medical marijuana. People who support this and are okay defying the federal government and reclaiming that state power may have never heard the word nullification before, may think it's kooky, and yet when we work together with them on this very actual idea, this project to assert state power in contravention against the feds, we're actually in the process of doing nullification. So is it that we need to go preach the term and preach the doctrine, or are you guys more focused on just actually doing the policies and the projects that are nullification and the 10th Amendment without necessarily being so explicit in that terminology?
Well, I think it's kind of a combination. It depends on who you're talking to. So there are different niches. We try to reach as many people as possible. And as we grow, instead of just focusing on the historical education, the proper role of government or the Constitution, this is where nullification came from. And we actually even kind of learned quite a bit more since then. We can actually take, instead of going just back to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison on kind of formalizing the principles of nullification, we actually start to go further back, all the way back to Patrick Henry in the Virginia Resolves against the Stamp Act. He specifically included one of these resolutions that said, when they try to give you a tax law that was not enacted by your local legislature, you're not bound to obey them. This is kind of the underpinning of the entire principle. So we go real deep into that stuff. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, when you want to reach more people and put this into practice, we're not just trying to teach this just to write books or create videos. We really want to advance liberty, and we believe that the most effective way to advance liberty is by decentralizing. If we're talking about individual liberty, the closer to the individual that we are with the decision making, the better chance that we're going to have more liberty. So we want to bring things out of Washington, D.C. towards the states, and from there, people in each state can bring things out of the state capitals towards the local and towards the individual. So we want to put that into practice. You use marijuana as an example, and I think that's the granddaddy of the modern nullification movement, because here's a situation where here in California, where I live, back in 1996, right after I moved here from the Midwest, they passed Proposition 215, and everyone said, you know what, supremacy clause, supremacy clause, supremacy clause, you can't do this. In fact, 2, if not 3 different presidents came here to California to lobby against the bill, claiming that because the federal law said you can't do this, that California wasn't going to be able to do it. Well, they did it anyways. So what's more important than using the terminology is showing people that you don't have to wait for permission from Washington, D.C. to exercise your rights. And we mix it all together, but the end result is really what's most important.
That makes sense, and I agree with you that this is kind of the granddaddy of the movement. It's a topic that a lot of people see that because of federal inaction and obstinance, the ridiculousness of scheduling cannabis on Schedule 1, claiming that it has no medical benefit, and yet we see ample evidence now that have been popularized in the media of people who have been legitimately and regularly helped because of cannabis. And so when presented with that information and this, legally cognitive dissonance, people, I think, clearly see how wrong the federal government it is, and at the same time how wrong it is to deny a patient a medicine that they need. And so they then gravitate towards that very emotional support of the individual. Yeah, we need to do, what's right to help that person. And so they become much more comfortable with defying Congress in that case. So that's the granddaddy of the movement. Maybe share another hot topic or two. What are some of the other issues bubbling up in American politics and at the state level that you think are good practical examples of this nullification idea that are maybe palatable, kind of like medical marijuana? Are there other examples where people are kind of gravitating to this idea, supporting the concept of actually implementing nullification, but based on this actual other policy that they support?
Yeah, I think there's many actually. For some of them that we work on are working to end civil asset forfeiture, which many people would recognize as only a state level problem, but it really isn't, because there's two actual asset forfeiture programs. And if we're just kind of going to the basic, this is where the government, in essence, charges your property with a crime, and then you have to prove that it wasn't involved in a crime to get your property back. So they just steal stuff. And we want to see that ended all over the place. But so, for example, here in California, again, a few years ago, the state passed some of the most strict restrictions on the use of asset forfeiture by law enforcement. But what they did, or what they failed to do, was they failed to address what's called the Federal Equitable Sharing Program. Mm-hmm. And in that situation, if a state law enforcement or a local law enforcement agent wants to just take some stuff from someone without due process, and the state restricts them from doing so, what they do is they go to the DOJ in Washington, D.C. I mean, they're not necessarily flying there, but they contact their federal partners, is what they call them, and say, hey, you know, this looks like a federal case. You mind if we partner up with you guys and work on this? So they take someone's property, then they claim it's a federal case. Then it comes under the Federal Equitable Sharing Asset Forfeiture Agreement, and the local law enforcement does an end run around the state restrictions, and they get up to 80% of the proceeds, whether it's cash or property or whatever, through the federal program. So it's essential then for states to then opt out of that federal equitable sharing program. We've seen a number of states opt out to as much as about 85%. Colorado, Nebraska, New Mexico, here in California, some of the strictest restrictions on that, Ohio and elsewhere. Asset forfeiture is extremely important. I think a really interesting one that actually is being expanded there in Utah is raw milk. The federal government takes the position. They actually have put out a statement where they believe that they not only can ban the sale and ownership and production of unpasteurized milk across state lines, but they hold the view that they can actually prohibit it within intrastate commerce, whether it's produced solely in state. And so just this year, SB 108 there in Utah expanded the amount of raw milk production and sales that people can do in Utah. And our view is the more that you get the state and local governments out of the way, the more that people can exercise their rights on something, then the less likely it is that the federal government will ever be able to come in and put down the ban hammer and stop these people. And this is really the marijuana model. If you legalize what the federal government prohibits, you open the door for the market. Once the market gets in, markets are more powerful than government. People start commerce, they start businesses, they start consuming products, and then it becomes a popular thing. People realize that the world doesn't end because either a plant is legal or a dairy product is legal. And I would like to expand that to things like, your right to self-defense. People should create sanctuary states for the right to keep and bear arms, because once you allow people to carry their weapons the way they should be, defend your property and your family, it's a personal choice. Get government out of the way locally and on the state level, then it becomes harder and harder for the federal government to enforce the prohibitions that it definitely wants to enforce.
So we work with people on these policies, whether, raw milk or civil asset forfeiture or medical marijuana or whatever. And so the concern could be that people do not see into those issues the same things that you and I do. They don't see this nullification idea. They maybe have blinders on. They're a little bit myopic in saying
that's cool.
Right, like, hey, this is just a good policy, so we should do it. Whereas you and I want to extract from that the lessons of nullification, the lessons of, flexing our political muscle, embracing that state level power. How have you found any success, or how do you think we can do that by working with people on this issue, but then trying to educate them and get them to apply, the same principle, the same philosophy to other policies? Have you given any thought to how we kind of help them to be more consistent and apply those same ideas to other policies?
That's not something I actually spend a lot of time on. In fact, I think a lot of people are very much lost when it comes to kind of expanding these principles to a broader philosophy that supports liberty. I think there are other organizations that are much better at that. You guys on a state and local level organizations like FEE, Foundation for Economic Education, Mises Institute, they do far better at teaching the broader principles. We just want to do is get success issue by issue so we can go, oh, wow, you know what, gun rights people? You notice how much a lot of people on the right are complaining about immigration sanctuary cities in California? Well, they're not doing that because they're failing. They're doing that for a reason. These localities, even if you oppose them, are obviously extremely effective at undermining these federal immigration laws. Well, why don't you examine what they're doing, which is what we do. I've personally actually read about 200 or so of these sanctuary city ordinances to learn from them because I want to know what's working. Why don't you create a sanctuary city or a sanctuary state for the right to keep and bear arms? You'll be very effective at it if you do. I mean, there's some 300 odd cities, and now you look at like full states like California that are doing this, and they're getting away with it. And then as you go to the courts to try to stop them, it's not looking very likely that the federal government will be able to stop them in the courts either. So let's apply this on everything across the board.
Do you feel that the Constitution within the liberty movement is less in vogue than it was a decade ago? Let me preface that a little bit. During when I was working with the 10th Amendment Center and Tea Party and everything, when that was at its height about a decade ago, my feeling was that everyone was Constitution, 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 perhaps in part because of the leadership of Ron Paul that was really, pushing that message and talking to his colleagues about how they needed to support the Constitution. And, of course, the message of the 10th Amendment fits very well within that. What I found is that, or what I've observed personally in the past decade is it seems like the liberty movement has begun to focus less on the Constitution and more on the kind of political philosophy that perhaps underlies the Constitution or goes further in some cases perhaps than the Constitution. Have you, as you're trying to kind of market your message and find allies within the movement, do you share that observation or have you seen something different? Do you feel that this constitutional message is as strong or effective or important to people kind of in this broader movement? What are your thoughts on kind of the overall temperature and the overall focus within that quote-unquote movement?
I think it's actually more like a slow-moving river. So I can use myself as an anecdotal example. Although I never voted for someone for president, I thought early on that the only solution to problems were to either march on D.C. or call your congressman or find a new president to support if you could find one. And after a while, you learn, well, you know what? This is all awful. It never works. It never gives me the results, or people change their position, as the wind blows. Well, you know what? Maybe I'll, instead of focus on president, I'll focus on senator or someone in House. You know what? I'll focus on the governor. And as people learn that things don't work on the big level, they tend to start looking closer to home again towards the individual. Some people, they get stuck in like the next person, the Gary Johnsons of the world are going to, suck in all of their energy, and then, they'll never get a win and they're going to die always wanting more liberty in Washington, D.C. Other people are going to say, you know what, I'm going to focus on a state level, or I'm going to focus on entrepreneurship, or I'm going to focus on agorism. It kind of just depends on the individual. And we're always finding that even as people kind of leave our movement, maybe for other parts of things in the broader liberty movement, maybe they become an ANCAP, an anarcho-capitalist, someone who believes that there should be no government in any situation. A lot of times, many of those people still support the work that we do because they see us undermining these federal programs, and that's very good. But then as every person leaves, there's another couple that come in and support us. So we're continually growing, even as the Republicans have taken charge. Some people thought, oh, you guys are going to be in a lot of trouble coming in soon, but absolutely not. We continue to grow. We continue to push forward. And I think there's a lot of people in the world that still don't embrace this message. So we've got a long way to go.
I'm glad you mentioned that because thinking of my observation, I agree with you that even those who have kind of quote unquote moved on or focus on more on the ideas and the principles, still have an affinity for the constitutional arguments, in part because they recognize that that's the language of government, right? So we can go talk about all these crazy, fun, philosophical ideas all day long, but at the end of the day, when you have these elected officials who've sworn an oath to uphold this document, you might as well use the language of that document to fight for liberty, which is precisely what you guys are doing, is it not?
Yeah, and there's a great line from Tom Woods where early on he wrote this article about the power of the executive dealing with war powers. And he prefaced this article, and this is 5, 6, 7 years ago that he wrote this. Like, he says, the Constitution isn't really something that we're going to sell these politicians on, but it's important to point out the line that they're crossing because it exposes the hypocrisy of these people who are ruling over us. So there is an educational positive result in putting out that message, even if you don't think that. A lot of people in the liberty movement, just to kind of shift directions lightly, they look to the Constitution and they cite an old philosopher, an anarchist philosopher, Lysander Spooner, and he had this quote where he basically said, what we have today, the Constitution either failed to stop it or created it. But anyone who has read into the philosophy of this, Human Action is a great book to look at from Mises. We know that words on paper actually can't do anything positive or negative. It really is up to people to take action. And if the general public, if the market is saying we love socialism, we love big government, there's a different educational message that we need to work on. And that's why I think organizations like Mises, Fee, Libertas, and others are so important to kind of, even when we don't work directly with these organizations, I think philosophically and in the bigger picture, we're all pushing towards the same goal, again, more liberty.
Well, and it's important to speak, as you said, there's a bunch of different niches that you guys are focusing on, and you speak differently to the different groups, kind of in the language that they understand. And whether it's groups like the ones you just mentioned or your group talking more in the constitutional language, we're basically all saying similar things. We're just using the languages of our different audiences to try and increase liberty, to try and get more people to support. So that completely makes sense. I want to ask this, though. You've quoted a lot of people and tossed out a lot of quotes that I'm familiar with, you're familiar with. Okay. What would you what would you suggest to kind of the introductory listener who's curious about these ideas, who wants to learn more? Is it Tom Wood's book, Nullification? Is it an article or two on your website? Where would a person go to learn more about the doctrines and the ideas and the principles behind the 10th Amendment?
Well, I think there's so much to learn. The best place to start is going to be, we do a free annual report, which is called the State of the Nullification Movement Report. This is where we give an introduction to the principles. We talk about the strategy, how it works, the legal principles behind it. And then we also give an update on a year-to-year basis of how things are going issue by issue, whether it's on surveillance, the right to keep and bear arms, on healthcare freedom, on medical marijuana legalization, the Right to Try Act, which there in Utah you've gotten passed and now expanded to include, for a very narrow portion of people, the right to use marijuana if you're on your deathbed. So there's a lot of issues that we're covering. That's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. It's generally 50 to 60 pages per year, and it's a free download. So you're going to get a lot of good stuff there. And then, of course, if you're digging around our website, you're going to find tons of other authors. Tom Woods' book, Nullification, is a great one. Mike Meharry, who has been working with us for a long time, has a couple of books and handbooks that we've got out there. Just kind of dig around, start reading stuff. There's a lot of free content that I think people can start with. And when they get hungry for more, feel free to drop us a line and ask.
That's great. In looking over your report, certainly you guys dig down into the weeds of the progress and the action, but that's
a pun, right?
Unintentionally so, but yes. But yeah, the introduction, you guys are kind of talking about the doctrine, pointing out a lot of the thinkers and their thoughts and the principles behind it. And so definitely recommend that for listeners who are, driving or whatever. The episode number today is 82. And so we will link to that and other resources at the show notes page, societyandthestate.com/82. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. This is such an important work that you guys are doing. I'm glad you're kind of taking note of everything that's happening, encouraging more of it. We need your voice. We will link to the resources on your website. People should go there and learn more. So thanks again for joining us today.
You rule. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.